recognizes
the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes
The lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and I'm really glad you're here. If you would please subscribe to our podcast and leave a 5-star rating or give us a thumbs up, depending on your platform, it would make our day and we'd greatly appreciate it. So I'm going to turn right to our guest. Dr. Steve Gelfand is a retired, board-certified rheumatologist with 50 years of experience in the practice of medicine, including clinical rheumatology for 45 years, as well as experience in the practice of internal medicine, academic medicine, and the teaching of rheumatology, disability medicine, and as a medical expert in medical legal cases for families of victims who have died from the overprescribing of opioid painkillers. Dr. Gelfand, welcome to Sagely Speak.
Well, very glad to be here, Mary.
Well, thank you. You and I have been pals on Twitter and social media for quite some time, and I think that's what caused us to connect here, and our mutual friend, Ed Bish, of course. But I thought I'd reach out to you and get your perspectives from, your history, your longtime history in the medical field, and what you saw, what you're observing, and how you felt things were changing for the worse, and if you felt powerless or how you felt when you saw things sort of going off the rails with early on prescription painkillers.
Right. I'd just like to state that, I've had experience, as you mentioned, I've been in medicine for 50 years, and it spanned 2 generations of physicians, which includes the generation before the opioid revolution, starting with OxyContin in 1995. And my experiences during that time, which stemmed from the 1960s to the time I retired in 2018, I think my observations beforehand are important in understanding what happened. And I think it's really important to understand the past and acknowledge the mistakes which have been made in order to prevent, disasters such as the opioid epidemic in the future. The opioid epidemic being, the worst public health drug epidemic in United States history. So, I think that's important. The information is also out there already. I mean, there's been, in addition to the known medical history and the medical literature, there's been great books written about this, such as Pharma by Gerald Posner and Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe, and also in the legal profession, the then Attorney General of Massachusetts, Maura Healey's lawsuit against Purdue and the Sacklers a few years ago, as well as a recent video streaming, such as Dope Sick on Hulu, which was based upon Beth Macy's book Dope Sick, and also more recently Painkiller on Netflix, which was based upon the Empire of Pain, as well as the book Painkiller by Barry Meyer in 2003. So the information was out there.
Right, let me jump in here, Dr. Gelfand, because you just outlined a whole bunch of publications, books, all of this kind of stuff. But why did it take people so long to write these books or to see what was happening? We were witnessing people dying across America, but it took a long time. I think there were some journalists early on, some physicians early on who were courageous and trying to ring the alarm bell. But your point on how do we not let this happen again is a good one. It's the whole point of the conversation and why we are talking about it still. But what good is it if it takes us so long to react and to wake up to a problem?
You're right. You're right. It took much too long. Barry Meyer did write about this in 2003, and I myself and other physicians have been, involved in giving the warning signals about this, since the early 2000s. Art Van Zee, who was in the book Painkiller, was one of the first in the nation to give the warnings about what was going on, what was happening. And this was in the early 2000s, where he testified at the FDA and presented all the pitfalls and warnings about the indiscriminate and non-selective use of opioids for every type of pain. But what happened was really a perfect storm, based upon a number of events which occurred. I can review some of these. It included the false medical narratives that were disseminated when OxyContin came out in 1995 by Purdue Pharma, and at that time, the president of Purdue Pharma, Richard Sackler, was giving to the medical community a number of false medical narratives in regard to OxyContin and opioids in general. In addition, he had the help of key opinion leaders in the field of pain management, with the complicity of the FDA, which approved OxyContin. The problem was they approved this drug for chronic non-cancer pain conditions well beyond the indication in cancer and end-of-life pain for which it was originally intended. So these medical narratives and messages, in addition to the unethical and dishonest marketing techniques used by Purdue Pharma to sell OxyContin, these were started years before in the 60s by his uncle, Arthur Sackler, when he was responsible for the marketing of Valium.
Dr. Gelfand, I want to get to I think that people understand these facts. I think that they're indisputable any longer. Again, we've talked about the numbers of books and films that have been out about it, congressional testimony. Can we pivot here to you as a young physician? Had you been a practicing young physician at the time or new into this, how was it that the misleading marketing techniques and the pressures and all that they did, how was it that a young physician might accept this? Is there enough pain management taught in medical schools? Let's quit adjudicating what we know are the facts. Let's talk about sort of the subtext, the undercurrent of this all, of the perfect storm. What conditions were ripe that would allow this to take hold? Again, I felt that physicians were not being taught enough about pain and pain management. I also believe, correct me right or wrong, agree with me, disagree, that physicians now have such a tight schedule and practicing medicine is very difficult. And sometimes it's the force of the business that things seek the lowest level. And I'm not saying that as a whole about the medical practice, but there's so many constraints on physicians now that would set the tide for this to occur, right?
Yeah, certainly. But unfortunately, what happened was that the knowledge that we had in the past was forgotten with this rush to prescribe opioids. Now, young doctors in medical training at the time that OxyContin came out were not familiar with the history of opioids in the past, and that's unfortunate because it was all documented. This wasn't new information. But when they came out with OxyContin and with the help of certain of these key opinion leaders of pain management, they disseminated, an entirely different perspective about opioids and its addictive nature, which young doctors might not have been familiar with. But I lived through these other, and I practiced during the time before this. When I was a medical resident in the late 60s and early 70s in New York City, there was the onset of the heroin epidemic in New York City, which was facilitated by the Vietnam War. And I took care of some of the most difficult medical complications of heroin, and I developed an appreciation for the addictive nature of heroin and what it can do to both the body and the mind. And when they came out with OxyContin years later in 1995, I was just flabbergasted that they would be promoting, an opioid drug which was similar to heroin to be used for pain conditions which were well beyond that of cancer and end of life pain. So this was I had a totally different perspective of this, where young doctors, were being given false information, at the time that OxyContin came out. And unfortunately, what they did, and this was true with Valium too, because the Valium epidemic took place at the same time of this earlier heroin epidemic in New York City. And the Valium epidemic was developed by, a new type of medical marketing, which was orchestrated by Richard Sackler's uncle, Arthur Sackler. And he developed Valium, which was known as Mother's Little Helper, into the most sold and prescribed drug of its kind at the time Valium was going on. And what they basically did, he was a psychiatrist who studied research, the effects of drug on and it would be difficult to not believe that the nature of these drugs, both Valium and OxyContin, which had effects on the brain, and led to dependency and addiction, that they were not monetized and became exceedingly important commercial successes, because of the fact that patients were going to doctors to continue their use. And so it was the repeated prescriptions which really led to commercial success, both of Valium as well as OxyContin. And this is what they basically did.
You mentioned something again, Steve. We're kind of laying out the facts as we already know them to be. I'm trying to get to something a little bit deeper here. You mentioned the Vietnam War, and we all know that when our warriors came home, they were stigmatized with or without a heroin addiction. It was a very difficult time. Can you talk about stigma, the stigma then and the stigma today, how you see it? And again, stigmatizing drug use, people have various thoughts about it. We do not want to make it okay to start drug use. That's a given. But at the same time, in the medical practice, in your experience, were you able to have open conversations with your patients up front and ask them if they were addicted to anything? Because oftentimes it seems physicians don't ask that. And it seems more and more you go to the doctor and you fill out 5 pages of pre-appointment history, medical history, but nowhere on there is, do you have an addiction?
Right.
And so have we come far again from the stigma of the returning Vietnam War here, warriors, to where we are today, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, I think there's a more understanding of addiction today, but it's actually addiction is one of the most difficult diseases in medicine, both in diagnosing and in treating, just the nature of addiction itself. Addiction is characterized by denial, by deceptive behavior, by abusive behavior, and by withdrawal syndromes, and by relapse. And of course there's stigma associated with addiction, which still remains a problem today. Medical doctors today, particularly when they have a patient on chronic opioid therapy, they're rather recalcitrant to face up to the possibility of addiction. Many patients have actually developed addiction and have been very, very skillful in hiding that from their doctors. And doctors themselves are under pressure to not necessarily suspect or diagnose addiction, especially when they're dealing with a chronic pain patient. Chronic pain and addiction are very often intertwined. Most patients with addiction do have pain, which can be complex. So doctors are not anxious to face a patient and tell them that they may have addiction.
We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off. Mothers for Awareness and Prevention of Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. And now, back to our interview. Let me ask you, Dr. Gelfand, there is a lot of pushback that a lot of patients who have legitimate pain cannot get the medicine that they need. And I believe some of that is true. A great deal of that is true. You might be overcorrecting in some regards here, but how do you are known, along with a few others of your colleagues, you're known for being an advocate in this field. And there's tremendous pushback on why you're keeping pain pills out of the medicine chest of people who truly need them for their chronic pain. How do you respond to that?
Well, there's no doubt that that patients that there are certain patients that certainly need opioids. And I'm not saying that they should never be used, because they are beneficial for acute pain conditions and post-surgical conditions, as well as traumatic pain and of course the pain of cancer and end of life. But the problem was in patients with chronic non-cancer pain. The majority of them, and it's been shown in the medical literature, that there was never sufficient evidence for the long-term safety and effectiveness of chronic opioid therapy for these non-malignant conditions. And this has been repeatedly shown. But there are certain patients who benefit from opioid therapy, very selective patients who don't have a history of substance abuse and don't have significant mental health problems. Those patients will benefit, but they're a distinct minority. In the field of rheumatology in particular, I had patients on opioids, but there were a very small percentage of all the patients that I treated. So it's a big difference between that and recommending opioids for the vast majority of patients with non-malignant pain, which is what happened. It was recommended just for about every type and gradation of pain, and doctors started to overprescribe and use opioids non-selectively, which resulted in the addiction of millions of patients. And this also was what led to the subsequent heroin and fentanyl epidemics that we're struggling with at the present time. What I'm saying is that opioids can be indicated in patients with non-malignant pain, but it's a small minority compared to all the patients that have these conditions. In rheumatology, we've seen some of the major types of chronic non-malignant pain, like patients with different types of arthritis or fibromyalgia or low back pain. These are common conditions that rheumatologists treat, but the majority of patients, the vast majority, don't require long-term opioid therapy.
So do you think the medical community has figured it out now? Where are we, and what do you see in the future as far as getting beyond this?
I mean, I think that many doctors recognize that the overprescribing of opioids was a major problem, and that they are much more discriminate before they decide to start an opioid drug for a patient with chronic pain. I think we've come a long way. I think organizations I was an advisor and a rheumatology consultant for a physician organization called PROP, I know you've heard of that, Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, and they have made major contributions to putting the brakes on opioid overprescribing, for particularly for chronic pain. It also contributed to the CDC opioid guideline, which was first uh, came out in 2016. So I think we've come a long way, but there still are problems. And of course, today we have the fentanyl epidemic, in which the Mexican drug cartels have basically taken over from the opioid manufacturers, in regard to manufacturing and trafficking fentanyl, which is a major problem in itself.
It absolutely is. And it is, you can compare the two or say that the fentanyl epidemic is built on the backbone of the earlier prescription pill epidemic. However, the mechanisms are different. And this is a much scarier thing. The cartels and the Chinese looked at what was happening in America with the pills, and they said, wow, this looks like a great business. Let's get into it. And they have, of course, become narco terrorists. They have create vast networks, both from China to Mexico, and then every community in America. And it is scary. It's totally scary. And I think we're putting a lot of our efforts now in how do we address it. And what I believe is so much of this begins at home, having a conversation with the people that you love about the dangers of certainly the illicit pill supply, but all drugs, recreational drugs, or partying with pharmaceutical drugs. And so it takes it full circle again, because the only thing we have, the best thing we have to protect ourselves against fentanyl is a conversation, an open conversation, and to talk about the problem. And for some reason, there's still stigma. I asked a parent if he had talked to his two high school kids about fentanyl, and he said, "Ooh, no, that's a difficult conversation to have," which I don't understand. But my point to you here is how important is, whether it's a patient or it's just an American citizen, how important is it that we are armed with our own facts and our own knowledge, and that when we go into a doctor's office, we want to ask questions. And again, I'm a firm believer there's a time and a place for opioids, absolutely. But I also think patients need to be better educated, and parents need to be better educated. That's the best thing we have.
You're right. And the education is so important, and this stems from proper education, from in regard to prescription opioids, because we've had innocent young people who have been who have used prescription opioids recreationally, many deaths in that regard. Individuals like Ed Bish has brought that to the light, and we thought we were, educating, these young people, but we need to do a lot more, because the Mexican drug cartels have taken over in regard to, increasing their trafficking of substances, which are now contaminated with fentanyl. And the outcomes can be very severe, because it's taken so many lives of young people. And this is a major
Let's
problem.
be clear, though. They're not contaminated with fentanyl. They are deliberately designed with fentanyl. They are fentanyl.
Right.
So they're not contaminated. Contaminated is, yeah, let's be clear about that. These are not a dirty lab where accidentally a little fentanyl gets mixed in. It is deliberately designed.
Right.
They're deliberately
Right.
trafficking in fentanyl. So it's not
That's
contamination.
what I meant.
Yeah.
I think they started with heroin in regard to preying on the patients who were addicted to opioids, in which 3/4 of them became addicted from prescription opioids, and then they were no longer able to obtain these prescriptions from their doctors, and they turned to the street, and they were able to easily obtain heroin, and then they started to lace heroin with fentanyl. And then they started to do the same thing with multiple other drugs, including cocaine and methamphetamine and the prescription pills, not prescription pills, but counterfeit pills, which are laced with fentanyl. And this is a major problem because the young people are, obtaining access to that and dying. And it's even worse now than it was with the prescription opioid problem. I think just in
Absolutely.
2023, almost 75,000 deaths from fentanyl, which is much more than it was with the prescription opioid problem.
Well, the good news is, and I know we're about to run out of time, but it took a long time for law enforcement, oversight to catch up with prescription pills, to arrest some of the folks, to see lawsuits, big lawsuits, pill mill doctors being put out of business, pill mill doctors being sent to jail. But now, fast forward to now we're battling the cartels. And these are not just your local street level dealer. These are very serious transnational criminal organizations that are very, very violent, no respect for human life whatsoever. So it has changed. But Dr. Gelfand, I just want to thank you for the work that you have done over the years, because you were one of the early people to stand up and say something is amiss, to say the least. And I know you took a lot of flack for it. You and others, Dr. Kolodny at Prop and so many others. And I would like to consider myself to be amongst those way back when we were getting a lot of pushback. So I just want to thank you. And let's hope that it never happens again, that we never need to be canaries in the coal mine with any respect on something like this with a very slow public response. So I just want to thank you very much for joining us on Sagely Speaking today. And you can follow Dr. Gelfand on social media. I know he's active on Twitter. Is that your favorite platform where people can find you?
Yeah, right now it's on X, and I've been posting about the opioid epidemic for I think the last 12 years or so. Most of my posts are related to that. And I appreciate your comments, and, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you. I'm sure our paths will cross again soon. And I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us on Sagely Speaking. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, you can reach us at hello@sagelyspeaking.com. And until we catch you on another episode, stay positive and keep the faith. See you soon.